Hello and welcome to Highlights. Again, this is a podcast where we get an opportunity to talk to individuals and other works throughout the Brotherhood that perhaps maybe you don't know about. And we have an opportunity to bring them to you and perhaps shed some light on them and the good that they are doing for the kingdom. Certainly appreciative of you being with us as I have an opportunity to host this alongside Michael Clark as the co directors of the Scattered Abroad Network here. We do want to there's a lot of new stuff going on here. If you're listening to this audio, it wouldn't make any sense that it's new because you're not watching it, but we are recording this through a new program online that we're able to bring people together and do a video format to this. So the highlights podcast from here on out is going to be audio and video as well. So these are going to go up on our YouTube page. So maybe you're listening to this and you want to go look at I guess you want to look at our faces and see what we're looking at, see what we look like. Maybe you don't want to. Maybe you just want to do audio only. But maybe you want to look at who it is that we're talking to and some of the things that they are involved in. Then go to our YouTube page, look up the Scattered Abroad Network, and you can find all of that information there. As you can find all of our other podcasts on scatteredabroad.org, our website. We do encourage you to go to all of those things. Again, I'm struggling remembering how to use this. I'm going to throw all this stuff on the screen for you. Again, our website, scatteredabroad.org. Also, if you do want to send us an email, you can do so at thescatteredabroadnetwork@gmail.com. And certainly we would love to hear from you, any kind of feedback or any kind of questions or remarks that you might have about this particular podcast or any of the things that we have going on here at the Scattered Abroad Network. Michael, it's been a while since we've done this podcast. Obviously, a little bit different how we do highlights, but I think it's very beneficial. Wouldn't you agree?
Yeah, I can tell you that some of the memories I have with us recording, most of them are this podcast when you and I do something together. Because I think about the podcast we did with the families of faith, and I bought like
Yeah.
the entire store while we did it.
Right. Right.
You know, there's so many good works out there that we don't really know who they are. You may not know who they are either if you're watching or listening. And I've been encouraged with the very little amount of episodes that we've been able to do, who all we've gotten to meet and how we've gotten to kind of learn more about the works that are going on in the Brotherhood.
Right. No, you're exactly right. A lot of, yeah, like you mentioned, some of these works that we've talked about, I didn't really even know about, or you didn't know about, but one of us did.
Right.
So we had an opportunity to collaborate and do things like that. So certainly appreciative of this podcast. I don't remember whose idea it was to do this, but it was a good one, and we're grateful to be able to do this. Today, we have a very special guest. His name is Andrew Young. Andrew, thank you so much for taking some time to be on the Highlights podcast with us.
Thank you very much for having me. I really appreciate the opportunity to be a part of the podcast here.
Absolutely. Andrew is a student at the Southeast Institute of Biblical Studies, and he is fixing to go back once he graduates to go back to Australia to continue hoping to help spread the borders of the kingdom there. And we are excited to have him on to talk about some of the work that he is going to be involved in and maybe some ways that you as an audience are going to be able to help him in this manner and in this way. But Andrew, again, thanks so much for taking some time to be with us and to be on this podcast. I know you're busy, you're in school, you're coming up on the end of your quarters and semester. So I know you got a lot going on, but thanks so much for being with us. Introduce yourself to us, to those who are listening. Obviously, you and I have a little bit of a connection, and we talked about that a little bit off camera or off when we were recording. But if you want to talk about any of that, just kind of introduce everyone to who you are and some of the things that you do.
Yeah, sure thing. So as was mentioned, my name is Andrew Young. I'm originally from Tasmania, Australia. So that's kind of the little island off the southeast coast of the mainland of Australia. Still a part of the country of Australia. People probably know it most for the Tasmanian devil. It's just kind of like an island state of Australia. That's where I grew up. I've grown up. My family was a part of the church there. My dad was a preacher down there. My dad obviously went to the Memphis School of Preaching with your dad, Caleb. So there's right. That family connection there that we've the Rutherford and Young clans have had a long established connection there.
Right.
I guess I grew up in Hobart, which is the capital of Tasmania. Grew up in the church, and for several years after several years have made the decision to get into preaching. So I came over to the Southeast Institute of Biblical Studies here in East Tennessee with my wife. Her name's Hannah, and I got. When I came here, I had 2 daughters, and now I've got 3 daughters. So I've got a 4-year-old, a a 4-year-old, a 2-year-old, and an 8-month-old now. So saying I'm busy is maybe an underestimation of what's going on with finals.
Sure.
3 daughters, all that's going on. But I'm certainly happy to take part in the podcast. So
I think it's really cool that you're able to kind of have an experience from being overseas and now in the States as well. You've spent some time now in the United States. You're going to go back to living in Australia in just a few months. Will you contrast what it's like living here versus what it's like in Australia? Because every time I've ever heard about Australia, they're always talking about the deadly creatures and stuff over there. And I have to think it's not that bad.
Well, what I like to say is, in Australia, it's the animals that are trying to kill you. In Tennessee, it's the drivers. That's the major difference that I found between the countries, and it's definitely
you're not wrong.
That's right.
But yeah, I mean, there's certainly some cultural differences, and I think like when we think of the similarities between the countries, we often kind of see, they're very similar kind of people, Australia and America. Moving over here, we weren't expecting too much culture shock, but there's certainly some. There's certainly culture shock in, that idea of what's trying to kill us, as well as, language barriers as well. We think we both speak English, but, I use totally different terms over here. So a guy over here gave me he lent me a truck while I was over here to study, and that was very, very kind of him. But he was looking at me weird whenever I called it a ute, and he was saying, "What's a ute? It's a ute, a utility vehicle." There's just all these different terms that we use that are totally different, and I guess probably to give the major contrast, the major difference between the US and Australia is probably a mindset thing. I find this if I'm, doing any kind of door knocking or evangelism or anything like that, is people have a totally different mindset. So over here, we did a campaign with the Southeast Institute of Biblical Studies, and knocking on doors, we'd ask questions like, maybe, what do you think happens when you die? What do you think happens after death? And most people are going to come up with a reasoned response to that. Well, yeah, I've thought about that, and this is what I think might happen, or this, that, and the other. In Australia, they're very pragmatically minded, and they don't think about the future. They don't think about what goes beyond this life. So you have a discussion like that with someone, you say, what do you think happens after we die? And they're just going to say something like, I don't know. And I guess we won't know until we get there. So,
Sure.
Culturally speaking, mindset, there's the mindset difference. And that certainly affects how, even just in regular conversation, how I interact with people over here versus back home in Australia.
Yeah, absolutely. A lot of differences. So my family and I visited Australia, visited Tasmania. I guess it was in October of 2008, I believe it was. We spent some time with you and your family. Of course, my uncle lives not you live in Hobart. He lives
Devonport.
south Devonport. Yeah, I don't like
Yes.
think of Devonport. He preaches there. Also works with the school of preaching that's there as well. So we had some connections there. But just in visiting, like you mentioned, the terms are different. The way you talk and the way that we converse is different. So certainly, I think some challenges probably that presented themselves to you in your decision to come over here and to go to the school of preaching. But I think perhaps maybe in some ways makes it a lot easier for you to go back, obviously, and teach the gospel, as opposed to someone like maybe Michael or myself trying to go there and to be there full time. It could present a lot of different challenges that maybe we would have to face that you wouldn't have to face because you've been there, you've established yourself there already.
Yeah, I guess I don't need to have that. When I do begin my work in Australia, I'm not going to have that like cultural assimilation process where I have to kind of get used to what the culture is. I'll be able to skip that and get straight into the work, which is certainly a benefit. But having said that, living over here for 2 years, it is easy enough to kind of identify the differences and identify where you need to kind of make those changes in conversation. So, you know, if you or Michael did come down to Australia, and I'd certainly invite you guys to come and help out with the work on a short-term mission trip or something like that.
Sure.
I think that'd be fantastic, as you did in 2008 with your parents. You know, it's not something that's unapproachable for people in the US. It's a mission field where people can see there's a few cultural differences, but where you're not like thrown out in the water in like a country, say a third world country with you know, a lot of cultural differences, a lot of language differences, where you're going to have a lot of those struggles. Australia is one of those places where you can kind of really ease into it. There are going to be some cultural differences, but you can identify them and overcome them pretty easily.
Sure, absolutely. Let me ask you this, Andrew, why preaching? I know obviously with your dad going through the middle school of preaching, it was there, it's been present, you know, in your life, with him preaching as well. So, but I guess, I don't know, it's kind of interesting to me because like, I mean, Michael and I both grew up with preachers as fathers. And yet for me, it wasn't something that I necessarily always wanted to do. It wasn't until later on in life I decided to do that. So why, I guess for you, why this?
I guess like what you said there's very true. I think most kids who grow up in a preacher home, the last thing they want to do is preaching. Like that is just, they see what goes on in the life of a preacher and they say, I don't want any part of that. They just want to keep away from it. But I feel like probably all three of us are evidence of this, that there's always something in the back of our mind that we recognize the calling that our parents responded to, and recognize the task in Scripture that Jesus gives his disciples to go into all the world and preach the gospel, right? We recognize that, and we have that in the back of our mind. And I mean, I worked for nearly 10 years in sales, customer service, and I thought that was what I was going to be doing. But I always kind of had that recognition of that role and recognition of that charge that Jesus gave to the disciples in the back of my mind. And it wasn't until probably 4 years ago that I made the decision, you know what, I do want to be a preacher. I do want to commit myself to spreading the gospel in the community in Australia. And I think the primary reason, there are a few primary reasons behind that. One of them was feeling unfulfilled in the work that I was doing, just kind of like I'm doing work, I'm making money out of it. I was working in a resolutions department in a telecommunications company. So basically taking phone calls of people who wanted to yell at me. And that's, you know, that's not a fun job for anyone. And kind of getting into that job, and I was making good money and I was doing well, I was providing for my family, but I felt very unfulfilled, thinking I could be doing more with my life, knowing what my dad did with his life and continues to do with his life, thinking, you know, that's kind of there in my mind. And the other thing was the great need for preachers as well, was the other thing that really stuck out to me. When I looked at we had a directory of churches in Australia. Entire country of Australia, similar in size to the United States, right? There's only 50 congregations of the Church of Christ in the entire country, okay? And about 10 of them have preachers, and even 5 have elders. So as far as like the statistics go of preachers to congregations, preachers in states and communities, there just isn't that much going on in Australia. So I guess feeling unfulfilled in what I was doing in my work and seeing a great need for preachers in Australia, I felt like and knowing that I had the upbringing to kind of get into this work fairly seamlessly. I could go to a school of preaching, do what my dad did and follow in his footsteps to some extent and get into that work. It was kind of just everything was lining up. The opportunities presented themselves. I had the ability, and I felt the responsibility was there to preach the gospel in Australia.
Certainly, that's something that a lot of people hopefully will be able to be influenced by you when you go back and make the same
Mm.
decision to preach. I know that's your goal, is to try to help the congregations there be strengthened, to help those that are outside the church be brought to Christ. And
Mhm.
man, I think it's a wonderful challenge, and I know that it's a possibility for you to be able to go there and make an impact, because we read in scripture that that has happened before.
Yeah.
And so I know the quality of work that you're going to do is going to be great, and a lot of that has to do with your education. Of course, Caleb and I went through Memphis, and so we're not saying anything negatively toward any other school. It's just where we happen to go. I did make sure to put, my Memphis logos here. You see that one there, and then I wore my Memphis polo. But you've made a decision to go to another great preaching school in Knoxville, Tennessee, Southeast Institute of Biblical Studies, or SEBS, as a
Mhm.
lot of people call it for short. Talk about your experience there as a student, kind of what you've been able to accomplish as a student, what you've covered, and what you're going to be able to take from those 2 years there back to Australia.
Yeah, absolutely. And before I get into that, I do want to say that I strongly considered Memphis before coming to
Sure,
Southeast. They were
Yeah.
both excellent schools, and
absolutely.
certainly appreciate both of them. Um, I guess, with everything that I've learned at school, I think when I started, before starting school, I was thinking, I'm in the position where I could be effective in Australia because I've got the cultural assimilation down. I could be effective in
Right.
that. So, I feel like often young preaching students come at this with maybe a level of ego, maybe a little bit of arrogance to it, like, maybe preaching school is going to help me out, but I feel like I'm pretty prepared to get into the
Mhm.
work. After my first year of preaching school, I realized how woefully unprepared I was to get into preaching.
Sure.
Thinking I had it all from my dad and everything, I realized, there's a lot more to this, and I've so greatly benefited from from my studies here, from the men who teach these classes. They're very, very qualified men, very well knowledgeable men in scriptures, and they've been able to pass a lot of that to me, as well as just kind of seeing the practical application of scripture for the minister, and seeing how the preacher ought to apply these teachings into his ministry, and how we ought to behave as preachers. A lot of that was very eye-opening for me, because again, growing up in a Christian household, growing out in a preacher household, you see some of what goes on. But your parents aren't going to show you everything that goes on in the life of a preacher, right?
Yep.
They're not going to show you, to a child, everything that they have to deal with. So I guess coming to preaching school has kind of given me the opportunity to see more of that side of thing. What is the unpleasantness of being a preacher, and how do you deal with those situations? So that's certainly been very, very helpful and effective with the school.
That's great.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I've always, I've been around Southeast a little bit. Of course, I know my grandfather taught some classes there. I know my uncle, I think he's still an adjunct professor there, if I'm not mistaken.
Yes, that's right.
And
He teaches our
I've
missions class.
Sure. And
Yeah.
I've had good relationships with Steve Higginbotham, a lot of other connections there. So I've always heard great things about Southeast, and obviously we're just excited that you chose a preaching school, period, to go to. Certainly, we're appreciative of that and all of the work that they do. Let me ask you this, Andrew: what exactly does it look like for you? You're getting ready to graduating soon, right? When is that?
I'm going to be graduating in May, end of May.
Okay.
So next
Okay.
month is my graduation point.
Sure. So you are right here, real close to it, right? So what
Yeah.
exactly does it
When
look
I get
like?
off this podcast, I'm going to be studying for some tests. So
Well, there you go.
that's how close I am.
There you
Yeah.
go. There you go. Obviously, best of luck to you
Thank
in
you.
that regard.
I need it.
Yeah.
But what exactly do your plans look like as you're getting ready to graduate? Kind of just the immediate time after. What exactly does that look like for you?
Yeah, and we have we were lucky in coming to preaching school that we actually had our plans laid out before we even got here.
Sure.
A lot of my fellow students are coming into preaching school and being like, okay, we've got to get a resume together, got to search for a job, find out what it is we're going to do.
Right.
And there's certainly part of that for me in getting ready for the work that I'm getting into. But we had already had a congregation to go to. We had a plan as to what we were going to do. And basically that is, as soon as we graduate from the school, 3 weeks after graduation, we're going to be flying back home to Australia and working with the Knowles Road Church of Christ in Adelaide, South Australia.
Okay.
This congregation is a congregation that I did actually have the benefit of working with very, very briefly. So we actually intended to come to Southeast in 2020. That was the plan. We had everything organized. We were doing our fundraising for school. We had it all set. We had tickets booked and all that. And then when COVID happened in March 2020, well, when the restrictions really happened in March 2020, we had to cancel our trip. So I lost my job as a result. At that time, I was actually working at the airport. So we were one of the first people to lose our jobs. We were unable to come to school because of the travel restrictions that Australia had very strict border rules with COVID. So we were kind of like stuck there for a year. Like we don't know what to do. The Knowles Road Church of Christ, they reached out to me at that time and said, look, we know you're planning on going to school. We know you've got these plans to do this. Why don't you move up to Adelaide, come here to South Australia and work with us for a year and just kind of get a bit of experience under your belt before going to going to preaching school. So I was able to work there kind of on a very much a part-time basis, still working a secular job in Adelaide, but I was able to work with the congregation for a year, get a feel for that congregation, really love that congregation and get to know each and every one of them. And by the time we left, we were saying, there's nowhere else we want to go. When we finish at Southeast, we want to be coming back to Knowles Road and working with that congregation. So we already had that plan and we already had that set up with the brethren at Knowles Road before we even got on the plane to come to Southeast.
That's awesome. So would you say that that's maybe, I don't know, kind of the way things panned out, maybe perhaps somewhat of a blessing in disguise for you, to be able to go work with a congregation for a year, get some experience, go to school, but then also know you have a place to come back. And then when you get back, also knowing that you don't really have those, that awkward phase of having to, settle in and get to know everybody, you kind of bypassed a lot of that.
Yeah, exactly. And it's incredible looking back how we see all these things that we saw as roadblocks as we were leading up to it. We can see now were hugely beneficial for us. And every time we're going through school now and we're seeing getting faced with problems like, hey, what if this comes up in your congregation? And we're able to kind of just apply that very, very specifically and say, hey, I think we could implement that at Knowles Road. And I think I know the perfect person to help with that particular project, or I know the perfect person to help do that work. So having that little bit of experience, little bit of pulpit experience, little bit of ministry experience, and just the security of knowing that I have a congregation that I love to work with and I do really genuinely desire to go to, I know that that's waiting for me on the other side of school. That was hugely beneficial throughout the entire process.
Absolutely.
Well, I know before I ask you my last question, you live on the campus apartments, right? Over there by the campground? Yeah. So I have a big connection there. Of course, I go to camp every year at TCC or Hillbrook. And so I've driven past those apartments for most of my life that they've been in existence and built. And so it's always nice when I get to make a connection with the people that have been living in there and studying because the goal is to preach the gospel wherever you went to school. It doesn't matter. As long as you're going to be faithful, I don't care where you go. Right. And I'm very excited to see what you do upon graduation. But there are, I'm sure, hurdles in order to make what you want to happen. There's some things that you need to do and accomplish. So what all do you need to happen in order to make these plans work as seamlessly as possible?
Yeah, and I kind of alluded to the fact that I didn't have too many worries after school because I didn't have to worry about a job and everything. There's still quite a lot that comes with what I'm doing that requires quite a lot of preparation before going back to Australia. The thing is, I mentioned in the earlier on that there are very few churches of Christ in Australia, and they're also very small. So Knowles Road itself has got about 20 members. which in Australia is considered an average size congregation.
Sure.
The largest one is in Queensland, and that's got nearly 100 people. So that's the largest congregation in the country of Australia. And with that, there's also not a lot of wealth in those particular churches, and very few can actually support a full-time preacher on their own. So what we're doing is we're basically we're going to Australia not just as a pulpit preacher at Knowles Road. My work is I'm going to be a missionary to the Adelaide and South Australia community. So what I'm doing is I'm raising funds currently and going through a fundraising process, speaking to congregations here in the States who are interested in supporting that kind of work, to try and get us able to be fully supported so we can go to this work and we can devote ourselves just to the work of ministry rather than having to take on a full-time job again and then kind of working part-time with the church. I think it's very beneficial for any congregation to have someone who works there full-time, and it's beneficial for any community to have an evangelist who can spend his days actually getting out into the community and preaching to the community and making contacts through that, which just would be impossible if I was working secularly as well.
Sure.
So my current goal is raising funds for the work, and basically I'm reaching out to any congregations who are interested in supporting a kind of work like this. So if any of the listeners know of any congregation that's particularly mission minded, interested in the work in Australia, or interested in anything that I've mentioned thus far about the work in Australia, we'd certainly love to hear from you. We'd certainly love to get in contact with you. And if you get in contact with either of these guys, then I'm sure they could get you in contact with me as well.
Yeah. Do you have like an email address or something that you would want people to reach you at, or how would you want people to reach you?
Yeah, certainly. So we go with we're the Young Family Mission. So if you go to youngfamilymission.org, you'll come to our website there. That's where most of our communications go through the website, but you can also just email directly to my personal email address, which is anw.young@gmail.com. So either one of those. What was that? Sorry?
Go ahead. No, go ahead. Youngfamilymission.org. Is that right?
Yeah, that's right. That's probably the best way to get in contact with us.
Okay.
You can sign up to my newsletter there. You can see what's going on while I've been at school. We've got a few updates going on through there, and that'll be the main mode of communication if you want to get in contact with me.
Okay, good deal. Well, certainly we will obviously push people that way if they're interested, and hopefully this will generate some interest, perhaps shed some light on you and some of the great work that you're going to be doing. Obviously, we are excited for you. We're prayerful that everything would go according to plan. I know you're entering a very stressful time. You got finals, and then you got to pack up and you've got to get moved. And then when you get moved, you got to settle in and, kind of get the work moving. So I know it's a long process, but I know that I have full confidence that you're going to do what needs to be done, and you're going to make a great impact on the communities that are around you. But Andrew, man, thanks so much for taking some time to hop on the podcast with you. And hopefully this has benefited you in the work that you're going to do. So appreciate that very much.
I appreciate it. Thank you so much for having me.
Absolutely. Always excited actually, I'm not supposed to close this. Sorry, I overstepped.
Yeah, man. Hey, man. Hey, that's what happens when you haven't done one of these in a year almost, right. It feels like. Right. Well, we are very thankful for youngfamilymission.org and all the work that Andrew and his wife and family will do. And you can check the show notes if you're listening to this for all of that information. You can also look on our YouTube description. We'll put all that in there as well, just in case you missed it. Don't forget that you can send us a work that you'd like us to highlight, and we would be happy to look into it and reach out to them and see if we can talk to them like we did with Andrew. Don't forget about our website. Our email address, I should say, is thescatteredabroadnetwork@gmail.com. You can find our website at scatteredabroad.org. And as always, we're thankful that we had the opportunity today to highlight the work that Andrew's doing, and we can't wait to highlight the next work together. But until then, take care.